he was out of the campaign. But another of Trump's foreign policy advisors was targeted by Russian spies in a game with even higher stakes. It's been a bitterly cold winter in Chicago, another city where the Trump brand has made its mark. This is the hometown of Donald Trump's former foreign policy advisor, George Papadopoulos, one of the central characters in the case for collusion.
The question you always ask is, are they witting or unwitting of Russian interest in them? So Papadopoulos may not have been witting of Russian intelligence interest in him.
Papadopoulos was arrested last October for lying to the FBI about his Russian contacts during the campaign.
He said that when I was arrested, I gave your number to the agents, like say, please call her to say, what's happened to me.
His wife, Simona, a lawyer, is telling his story because he can't. Papadopoulos is cooperating with Mueller's investigation of Trump campaign officials.
When time is right, he will share his own experience. So, as far as I know, Russia was a priority, and they were informed about every initiative he would take, and his purpose was to look bigger and to please his bosses.
George was a young guy in his 20s, a very ambitious guy, but he really didn't have the qualifications to be on the National Security Advisory Committee.
Just like Carter Page, Papadopoulos was plucked from obscurity to join Donald Trump's team of advisors.
I inherited George, and I inherited Carter and the others. So my job was to manage them and to make sure that they didn't embarrass the campaign, didn't embarrass Mr. Trump.
All talk, no action.
In the end, what happened to Papadopoulos went way beyond embarrassment. Papadopoulos' story takes us to London, the location of so many Russian spy stories from the Cold War to the present day. Here in 2016, soon after he was named as an advisor to the Trump campaign, Papadopoulos was cultivated by a Maltese professor, Joseph Mifsud, who boasted of high-level Kremlin contacts.
He's not someone that Papadopoulos would have been worried about meeting. What you don't realize is that behind that guy, maybe there are some nefarious people with some nefarious aims.
Until this name came up, which is Joseph Mifsud. At the time, I didn't know it was the genesis of the Russia investigation. I didn't know any of that.
La filosofia può aiutare.
Professor Joseph Mifsud taught at universities in the UK and Europe and ran an organisation called the London Centre of International Law Practice. Simona worked here for Mifsud.
They never paid me. And they said, don't worry, you have to think big, they told me. Joseph Mifsud said, you have to think big, you don't have to think about the salary. I thought everything was a facade for something different. I thought everything was extremely unclear and unprofessional. And my feeling were it was the most shady person I ever met.
Did you have any sense of his connections to Russia at that point?
Yes, because he was constantly in Moscow.
Professor Mifsud's first offer to Papadopoulos was to use his connections in the Kremlin to broker a meeting between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump.
I wish he could organize such a meeting.
Between Trump and Putin?
Yes.
Excited by the prospect, he took Mifsud's offer to a meeting of the Foreign Policy Committee, headed by future Attorney General Jeff Sessions, with the candidate Donald Trump.
One meeting we did have with President Trump in March of 2016, George floated the idea of a meeting with Putin and Mr. Trump. And that meeting idea was shot down by Senator Sessions, and the senator asked us not to ever speak about it again because it was a bad idea for a lot of reasons.
There are contradictory accounts of what happened in this meeting. Others at the meeting say this idea was dismissed, but Papadopoulos has said something different. He's told Mueller's investigators that he believes he got a green light.
What was his understanding about whether it was encouraged to continue?
I can't answer straight to this question because, again, it's the hot topic of the investigation, but I would give my personal opinion, which is it's very unlikely that a young foreign policy advisor would take an initiative or put forward an initiative without the blessing of the campaign.
Papadopoulos says his efforts to make contact with the Kremlin were approved by senior campaign officials. He checked everything with the campaign. He wasn't running around doing it himself?
No, never. Steve Bannon, definitely. Michael Flynn, yes, he was in touch with them. Brian Lanza.
And all of them, Steve Bannon, Lanza, Flynn, all encouraged him to continue his liaison with Russians?
Yes. He was trying to set up a meeting between Putin and Trump and never was stopped in this purpose.
On April the 26th, Mifsud invited Papadopoulos to breakfast at a hotel in London's business district. This was 2 months before the news broke about the Russian attack on the Democratic National Committee. Professor Mifsud had just returned from a trip to Russia. He had astonishing news. Over breakfast, Mifsud told Papadopoulos that he'd met high-level Russian officials on his trip to Moscow. Those officials, he said, had dirt on candidate Hillary Clinton in the form of thousands of emails. It's not clear where Mifsud got his information or why he passed it on to the young American, but the information was correct. It seems likely that the Russians targeted George Papadopoulos to pass that information back to the Trump campaign.
There's that possibility the Russians were throwing this out as, a little bit of churn in the water, a little blood in the water there for the sharks to come out. And it would have been the kind of thing that they would have been happy to give up, and it would have served their purposes. And the best way, for Vladimir Putin, the best way to soil our democratic process is link it in some conspiratorial way back to the Kremlin.
Did George tell the campaign what Mifsud had told him?
This is the object of the investigation going on, so there is secrecy out of that. I can't talk about it.
For the special prosecutor looking for evidence of collusion, this piece of the puzzle could prove to be critical. We don't know who in the campaign Papadopoulos told about the Russians' stolen emails. But we do know he passed on the information to another contact in London soon afterwards. At a wine bar in South Kensington, Papadopoulos met Australia's High Commissioner, Alexander Downer. How did he come to meet Alexander Downer?
I think he was introduced to him by his assistant.
Downer's colleague from the High Commission organised and attended the meeting, a witness to the conversation. It's been widely reported that Downer and Papadopoulos were drunk. Both men deny it.
I don't know how many they had to drink, the two guys, the ambassador and George. It basically fed into this witch hunt of here's this kid in his 20s mouthing off to this Australian ambassador who he probably shouldn't have even been with in the first place, both of them over drinks. And then that gets through the Australian intelligence to the US national intelligence agencies.
Papadopoulos told Downer that the Russians had dirt on Hillary Clinton and were planning to use it. Downer promptly cabled the startling information back to Canberra. After careful deliberation, it was passed on to the American authorities, prompting the FBI to open an investigation and send agents to London to interview Downer. So, The now far-reaching investigation into whether Trump or his associates colluded with the Kremlin may have started here at the Kensington wine rooms with Australia's former foreign minister.
You know, opening up an investigation about a presidential candidate's campaign in the midst of a campaign, that's a big step to take. And the FBI is going to be cautious about doing something like that. Doesn't necessarily mean that they think that there's active collaboration by people in the Trump camp, although you can't rule that out. But you want to understand what a major foreign adversary is doing on your soil.
Last year, 6 months into the new presidency, after a summer holiday with Simona, Papadopoulos flew back to the US. He was still hoping to secure a job in the Trump administration.
I was with my sister in Rome and just waiting for his flight to land. Then he was messaging me from the shuttle train. And then he told me, I see somebody staring at me in a suit and tie, and it's quite weird look. I thought he was paranoid, maybe he's jet lagged.
The man in the red tie was an FBI agent. He arrested Papadopoulos and took his phone. And then silence.
Yeah. They put him to jail, then to the courtroom. All this in the space probably of 48 hours. And he was literally scared to death.
To the best of my knowledge, George Papadopoulos never had a Donald Trump email address ever in his life. He was a volunteer like the tens of thousands of others.
As the bearer of another scandal linked to Russia, when news of Papadopoulos' charges broke, he was immediately denounced by the president and his former campaign colleagues.
He was the coffee boy. He had nothing to do with the campaign, and all of this contact with alleged Russians is something completely beyond the scope of his volunteer duties.
He wasn't a coffee boy, obviously, because then that fell into the narrative, well, if he's the coffee boy, why is he sitting in a meeting with the current attorney general and the current president, right in the middle?
George was constantly in touch with the high-level officials. He helped organizing the meeting between Trump and the LCC, the Egyptian president. So, I mean, of course, this is not the task of a coffee boy. He really was approved in anything he did. He was not a freelancer taking initiative on his own.
George Papadopoulos pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI. He surrendered his passport and is waiting for sentencing. For now, he's bound by his deal with the Mueller investigation to remain silent.
George is the person who was the target, identified by Miss Fludo to offer those hacked emails. He decided to cooperate with the FBI and is putting his knowledge fully at disposal of the government. So, as I said, it's a piece of a puzzle, but it's an important piece, and his contribution is going to make a difference.
This is the witch hunt of the century, and it's hoax meant to destroy the president and dozens of people around him. It's sickening, and the people who are doing these things, the media and members of Congress, really need to be held accountable.
You saw your nation convulsed by division caused by the Watergate scandal. How does this compare?
Well, I think what's going on now makes that pale. That was purely a domestic thing. We didn't have the involvement of a foreign adversary, or prime foreign adversary, Russia, in that. And so to me, it's much more worrisome.
So these are dangerous times.
They are.
Follow the money, follow the sex.
Hello.
Knowing his tastes and the fact that he's an extreme germaphobe, the idea of him being involved in the kinky scene, I find unlikely.
It is worth noting that sexual compromise was something very much in the FSB's playbook.
What I think Vladimir Putin was doing was deliberately leaving a trail of breadcrumbs from Trump Tower to the Kremlin.
Some funky lawyer was being sent to Donald Trump to try to seduce him into thinking that, that they could help his campaign.
I wouldn't call her just a lawyer. What I would say is that she's a Russian operative.
I have come a long way to ask this question. Are you a spy or an agent for the Russian government?